appreciate you all for your patience. The wait was worth it, right? Yes. Okay. I told you about me, and I could go on, but I'm just going to read their bios, and we're going to get started, okay? All right, so we have our moderator, Nsenga Burton, and she is an award-winning writer and entrepreneur. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the award-winning website, the Burton Wire, a news blog covering news of the African diaspora. Former editor-at-large for The Root, Dr. Burton is an expert on the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality with film, media, and technology. She was recently appointed inaugural Southern Regional Director, working with HBCUs to strengthen their entrepreneurial ecosystems. Tananarive Due, who's that? Is an award-winning, best-selling author of 16 books, including My Soul to Keep and Joplin's Ghost, a leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years. Due has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award. She teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA and is married to author Stephen Barnes, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. They live with their son, Jason, and 2 cats. Welcome to Tananarive Due.
All right, well, thank you. This is a real treat. I am very excited to be here. Those who know me know that this is my favorite author. Also my fellow alum from Northwestern, so we love that. Yeah, baby. Let's get into it immediately.
Get into it.
All right, so the Reformatory. I know that you talked about your uncle before, and in writing this book, I know that you talked about how difficult it was to do the research, which is why it took so long for you to write it. I know that you recently discovered another book that is in play. I do my research.
My Instagram on record.
I follow you.
I need to pull up my own Instagram.
So, can you talk to us a little bit about your process in writing this book? Because it's very hard to read, so I cannot even imagine writing it.
Trust me, it was so much harder to write. Thank you all so much for waiting, and I apologize for being late. I came from Sandy Springs at my sister's house, and that traffic I should have left 2 hours before this began. Yeah. Today is actually a great illustration of why this research was so difficult, and I will need to pull this up for reference for this gentleman's name. But the beginning was soon after my mother passed away. I actually lived in Atlanta and taught at Spelman College for 3 years because my mother was ill. And soon after she passed away in 2013, our family learned that she had an uncle who died at the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. We got a call from the Florida State Attorney General's office. They explained that researchers from the University of South Florida were going to go and begin exhuming because this facility, which was opened between about 1900 and 2011, was fraught with complaints from the time it opened, but my thesis is it was too big to fail in this town. It was too big a piece of the economy, much like our criminal justice system as a whole today. And as a result of that, several children died there. And so many children died there, there was a graveyard in the woods they called Boot Hill, but they didn't mark the graves, they just buried the bodies out there. And from the very first, when my dad and I went to the very first meeting, Dr. Erin Kimmerly was there. She has a book out now this year. I think it's called We Carry These Bones, which I admit I have not read yet because, and you'll see why when I tell you this next anecdote. But in any case, we went out to the school. There were survivors there, black and white, and that was it because it was a segregated facility, the black side and the white side. But one thing that everybody had in common was what they called the White House. And I think that's probably a depiction of the White House on the cover. I called it the Fun House in my book because I have a sick imagination. But the beatings were so severe that one of the survivors told me that he had to miss visiting day with his parents because he was in the infirmary because the doctor had to literally extract fabric from the wounds. Oh my God. These are children. So after hearing these stories, I knew I wanted to write about it. But having written a nonfiction memoir with my late mother, I was not that attracted to the idea of memoir. It's hard. I mean, I was a journalist for 10 years, so you would think I would jump, but I'm a novelist. If I could have written my mother's book as fiction, she wouldn't let me, but if I could have, I would have. That's how much I'm a novelist. So I decided, let me write a novel where I'll honor this young man, Robert Stevens, who unfortunately in 1937 did die at the Dozier School. They did find his remains, and they were reburied, I think, in 2015, while I was still laboring over this book. But I wanted to write it in a softer, gentler way, as a ghost story. It might seem weird to think that a horror novel is more gentle than reality, but I think for a lot of us who like horror, and horror is having a big moment right now, a lot of people are understanding, oh, trauma and horror actually have a relationship with each other. It's kind of soothing to see a horror movie under certain circumstances. So I thought, let me tell a more gentle version of the story. And that's where the Reformatory came out. But just to show why it took me so long to write this, since I'm in town and my 89-year-old dad is living with my sister, and he was on that first meeting with me, he went on several road trips with me. He gave me ideas for a courthouse scene, or a court chamber scene with the Jim Crow judge, because he, as a civil rights lawyer later in the 1960s, had similar moments with law enforcement and judges under Jim Crow. So he's very closely entwined with this story and isn't able to come out and spend this time with us. So I thought, well, while I'm in town, I had heard from a woman named Marshall Smith Berry on Facebook a few months ago. And she said, oh, I wrote a book with my dad called It Still Hurts. And I didn't know about the book. And in all honesty, I wish I had heard about this gentleman years ago, because many of the survivors who wrote memoirs were white survivors. And even though there were similarities in the experiences, I really wanted to find black survivors, and they were much harder for some reason to find. I think there was more fear of the system. He didn't talk about it, he said, for 40 years, to none of his children for 40 years. So I thought, well, I'm in town, he's 88, dad's 89, let me let those two talk on the phone. They have sort of that generational thing in common, and dad can talk about how we went to the school to tell the story, that the story is out. I was able to add his book to the acknowledgments. It's the very last book I added to the acknowledgments. But as soon as we got on the phone, this gentleman was like, it still hurts. And he proceeded to tell me stories. That was not what I was expecting. I was not expecting to ask him to tell stories. I didn't want to expose him to more trauma, just, in a friendly phone call. But woo, did he tell me stories. And there are some bizarre coincidences. He's changed his name now. But his name when he was at the school, which had a different name, it was called the Florida Industrial School for Boys. When he was there, his name was Robert, just like the character in my book. Yes. He was sent there when he was 12 years old, just like the character of my book. And while he was there, he knew of a student who was killed or died. I say was killed. So the similarities are uncanny. Even though I didn't know his story, I kind of knew his story. And when I tell you, I was wrecked when I got off that call. I felt sick to my stomach. My hypochondria flared up because I thought, am I getting sick? Did I pick up a bug? All that stuff. And then I realized, no, I need to meditate, because this is it. This is what it was like every time I picked up a memoir. Every time it was several years of this. I had a son who was very young at that time. He went to the grounds with us when the University of South Florida started that work. And by the way, they worked in war-torn regions like Kosovo. So this is sonar equipment to find buried bodies, because there were no markers. If your son died, they would just bury him. You might get a letter saying, we regret to inform you. And he also confirmed he knew someone who helped bury someone. So they had the children burying other children. I was worried that maybe that was just something somebody made up. Or no. It must have been common, frankly, for the first guy I've talked to in years to tell me that story. So it was very, very rough to do this research. But what drove me, well, grief from my mother, honoring that era, that 1950 is about when my mother was young, and she was growing up in rural Florida. And she never knew, I don't think, about Robert Stevens. There was another relative, her mother's brother, had been executed by the state as a juvenile. So when the state called me, I thought they were calling about that one. I thought, oh, well, maybe we'll get some more answers about this young. No, it's a whole different. So on both sides of her family, there were young men killed in either state care or state execution. Care is not the right word, but so that's just so much trauma, and I wanted to honor the spirit of Robert Stevens. I wanted to honor the rest of those boys who were just thrown like trash and buried out at Boot Hill at the Dozier School. I wanted to honor that entire era of activists, because the civil rights movement as we know it wasn't going to start for 5 years after I started this book in 1950 with the death of Emmett Till and the reaction to his death. And then by 1960, my mom and my Aunt Priscilla and students in Greensboro, North Carolina would be getting arrested in sit-ins. And my mom and her aunt and students at Florida A&M University would be staying in jail in Tallahassee, Florida as a part of a jail-in. And there was going to be a groundswell, and I'm forgetting the bus boycott too. Let's not forget the bus. So the civil rights movement as we know it hadn't started yet, but there have always been people fighting back. There have always been people organizing. It was lonelier maybe in 1950 or 1940 or 1930, but they were doing that work, which was one of the things that just so galled me about that movie Mississippi Burning, about Freedom Summer in 1964, and Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, like the black activists, were sitting on their hands waiting for the FBI to rescue them. Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness, one of my former students is here, Camille. I'm so excited. So I wanted to honor that generation. I wanted to create sort of a, what do you call it, like put time in a bottle. That's not what I'm looking for, but we're losing that generation. I've lost an aunt just this year who was looking forward to the publication of this book. I've lost my uncle who was looking forward to the publication of this book. And I want them to be remembered. I want them to be remembered. And because you hear young people saying, well, if I'd been alive then, right. No.
And that leads me to my next question. That's a great one. Because as I was reading this book, and I have to tell you, I was incensed the whole time. People have been catching hell at work for the last probably 3 months, because it took me a while to get through it, because I had to stop and take breaks, because it is that, it's that complex of a read. But one of the things that I love about the book, in addition to demonstrating, and you see this in Joplyn's Ghost, you see this in My Soul to Keep, and it's part of your, I would say, signature, is your ability to weave historical fact with fiction, and then mirror it, right, in horror, right? So we are literally living amongst the monsters. We're thinking they're out here, but they're right here in front of us, right? So you do a brilliant job of that. And I think in this particular book, you did, I mean, I don't even know really how to articulate it properly in a way that gives it the weight that it has. But you do, such a fantastic job of showing how hard this type of behavior, structure, system is on everybody, right? So, so I say that to say, when I was reading it again, because I read it twice because I'm a fan. But when I was reading it again, I thought about the shirts where it's like, I'm not my I'm not my ancestors. If I coulda, woulda, shoulda. And I was like, if you read this book, because you can read all the historical books, they're out there. All the memoirs are out there. We still have people who are alive who tell us these stories. Yes. So we know they are true. We have people who've lived this, right? Yes. But it's this woulda, coulda, shoulda. And it's like, this book shuts down all of the woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? It really shows how complex this was, and how hard it was on everybody, including the lawyers, right? Because, when we see the documentaries, it's like, Thurgood Marshall just comes out, Oliver Hill, they come out and they're these kind of, they're missing capes, but you don't see all the other things.
He
that
was
were
a
happening.
superhero.
Right, absolutely. But all the stress of it, the tension of it.
He was just as afraid of a dark road as anybody else.
Right.
More afraid, really.
Right, and so the attorney character, John Dorsey, in this particular book, when he starts out, when we first meet him, he seems a little flippant, a little disconnected, if you will, at least from Gloria's story, right?
He's a fancy New York lawyer in town.
But by the time she finishes talking to him, and we have to talk about why Gloria whispers so much.
Okay.
I want you to talk about that.
Oh, that's the first time anyone's brought that up. I have to think about that one.
Yes, she whispers a lot, but then she finds her voice in the end, obviously. But when but Gloria in that whisper, right, is able to break him down to where she can see all of him in a very short moment.
Wow.
Can you talk about that? Is that intentional?
I was just trying to listen to you talking about it. Well, I mean, we use the tools that we have. And I recently listened to the audiobook, which, please do, yes, buy a hardcover.
Fantastic. I listened to that too. It was fantastic.
Jodi Abbott Pratt, she was at my signing last night, and I tell you, I was never more nervous to read an excerpt in my life. But she is so good. She captures those voices. And first of all, I want to say about Gloria and her whisper. It's interesting you mentioned that. I'm just going to go in a stream of consciousness here. My late mother apparently had a very thin, whispery voice when she was in college, but by the time she had us and hormonal changes, she sounded more like Maya Angelou. Like, I heard a recording of her making a little speech as a pipsqueak in college. I was like, what? Who is that? I never knew her as that person. I never knew her before she was wearing dark glasses after she was tear gassed in 1960, which she did the rest of her life. They're in the Florida archives, her dark glasses. So she did not whisper a lot in our lives. So this is where we depart into fiction. In the novel, and I based Gloria on my mother. My mother's middle name was Gloria. So at every juncture, when I say, what would Gloria do? It's like, what would Mom have done? And that's what I told myself. And she does some pretty daring things, but I think is cowed to a degree by white supremacy and Jim Crow of that era. And you don't raise your voice. You don't raise your voice. And even with this black lawyer, she's trying to assess this situation. He's not there in town to see anything about her. And I made Harry T. Moore a character who would die, I think, about a year later, blown up, he and his wife, Harriet, by the Ku Klux Klan in Florida. So Gloria can see a whisper of his future because she gets signs from people sometimes, not every time, but sometimes. So it's a precarious situation. They're here on other business. She wants to convince him, and she's a listener. She's a listener. Sometimes activism is listening and learning, right? So she's been paying attention to what's being said at this meeting that has nothing to do with her, and she finds the very gentle, perfect words to convince him to go off his track where he was headed, and Harry T. Moore, to go to her little town where he was not planning to go, and do what I consider a miraculous thing, and this is not spoilery, but just to meet with the judge in his chambers. That is huge for her, a country girl. Even though her father was an activist, he was run out of town on a false rape accusation, which I used both because it happens so often. If you look at the mass murder histories, they're almost always sparked by, if not outright rape, then supposedly lecherous behavior by black men toward white women, whether it's Tulsa, Rosewood, I believe. The Groveland Four, which were written about by Gilbert King in The Devil in the Grove, which is a fantastic, if very difficult book. So, yeah, she whispers to get her way, but she can get her way.
Yeah, and I think in this novel, it's all of your novels, but in this particular novel, you being able to really tell us and show us how people are thinking, right? So the way you write is very musical. It's like, someone is, as she's whispering, we're still hearing her thoughts, right? And I think that mimics kind of the supernatural, the surreal parts of the book in that way. So let's talk about the character Blue.
Okay. No spoilers, though.
No spoilers.
Okay.
So the character of Blue, I found to be fascinating and very interesting. And I thought about it in the sense that, in terms of the experience of racism and white supremacy is global. And it really doesn't matter if you are, if you're brought here in chains or if you are a person of color at that time period, you know, Bahamian, Haitian, I would say Afro-Cubano, if you're talking about Florida, that the experience was similar.
Yes.
Right? So the character of Blue for me represented that global piece of how white supremacy is systemic. And
I'm sorry.
you're cracking me up.
I'm learning too.
It's the professor.
He does. I mean, that also was growing up in Miami, and we had a lot of Bahamians in Miami, and so that piece, yes.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what he represents in this particular novel relative to the rest of the black population that is in that particular school?
Okay, real briefly and in a non-spoilery way. Blue actually is reinforced by something the gentleman told me on the phone today. And I mean, when you think about the kind of infractions that would get children sent to such a horrible place, you think, wow, they must have done some horrible things. Now, Blue was just there because he was an orphan. His parents had sent him there, and then his grandmother died. There was no one to take care of him, so he ended up at this place. And that was something that was based in the history. Orphans, apparently, were some of the people who ended up here. Truancy was another reason you could end up there, which resonates today, because I don't know how many of you have school-age kids, but I know when my son was at middle school and he was just late to some classes too often, they were calling us talking about police intervention. I was like, see, this is a school-to-prison pipeline. This has not changed.
Right.
In fact, it's worse now. I think children are more criminalized now than they were in 1950 overall. So there's that. But in terms of Blue, I wanted to create, yes, that sense of difference, the diversity within the black population in Florida at that time. Also, he spoke differently. Oh my gosh, the audio reader does a beautiful accent for him.
Yes.
When I try to do it, I sound Irish. It doesn't work. But it's terrible. But she does a beautiful melodic just accent for him. But also, I think that it's because of his difference and the way he speaks that's so different. And he conducts himself a little bit differently. He wasn't born in the United States. So he doesn't know to be casting his eyes down and how he's supposed to act. And I think that's part of what got him in trouble while he was there. So those were some of the things I wanted to convey. And there's more, but you'll see.
Yeah, we're not going to spoil it. So one thing I did want to read, and also just on a side note, there's a school called the Cheltenham School in Prince George's County, where they actually came out today. I still read 10 papers a day. I know, I'm befitting of my age, I'm 51. But it came out in Baltimore Sun, if anybody wants to read about it. But it was a boys' reformatory school where there was sexual abuse and physical abuse and violence, the same thing. And they actually, the survivors have come together and this school closed in 2017. They've come together to have a class action lawsuit against them. So I was like, Kismet, it's Kismet. All right. So I wanted to read this to you, but you've read it.
Oh, shoot, I know what you're going to read.
Yes. So you're in for a treat. The Reformatory is one of those books you can't put down. Tananarive Due, hit it out of the park. That's Stephen King.
Yes! I was in the middle of an IG Live with a bookstore, it's a Sister Sci-Fi in Oakland, and someone wrote in the replies, you know how they float up? Stephen King is tweeting about your book. So I was trying to focus on the interview, but I'm typing to get over to my Twitter, what did he say? That was unexpected.
Yes. Okay, so when I saw that tweet, I thought about Octavia Butler. Because I do care about what Stephen King thinks. I've read all of his novels too.
But
I thought about I thought about who kind of influences, who I thought your influences are. But I want to know, who are your influences? What do you consider to be your influence?
This is a full circle moment in a lot of ways. Even though I'm on my way to the Miami Book Fair this weekend, and it was at the Miami Book Fair back in the 90s that I first performed with the Rock Bottom Remainders, which was a really bad rock band that writers were in. But it was fun, and I did meet him back then, and that was how some of you know he blurred My Soul to Keep. Right? So I was able to send it to him, and et cetera. But haven't had really any contact since. Now that was a long, long, long time ago. And the reason it's a full circle moment, see, I remembered what I was talking about, was because as a younger writer, you know, I'm sure I had other influences, even including Encyclopedia Brown. But the ones that really popped out, like when I was in college and we all ran around talking about who our favorite writers were, the first one I said was Toni Morrison.
Yes.
And the other one was Stephen King. And at the time, this was how genre bias works, because people were at least nodding and pretending they all knew who Toni Morrison was. But when I said Stephen King's name, you could just feel this like chill over the room, like, oh my God, she said Stephen King in these academic halls? Because, you know, flash forward, we didn't know that President Obama was going to give him a National Medal of Arts and that his work would be read for so many years, but it just was. My mother gave me The Shining, the silver cover, anyone remember that? When I was 16 years old. That was my first one. And I was just hooked. And it's a weird blending, I guess, Stephen King and Toni Morrison, but those were kind of two North Stars for me in terms of Morrison's, well, her phenomenal and complex use of language and her storytelling, but also just her integrity with Blackness, you know, expressing Blackness and Beloved, and oh my, and Mama Gloria was big too, because by the time I graduated from college, I was writing white characters. This was not a plan. This was not a strategy. This was just the canon. So a little black girl who'd been raised by civil rights activists, who'd been practically homeschooled on Black history, who'd been reading Black history comic books and had Black Barbie dolls, and Black Raggedy Ann and Andy dolls, okay? She came out of college thinking that a story was something that happens to a white character, a male character, having an epiphany of some kind. So I had leached out race, gender, and genre. There was none of me left. And then I wondered why I wasn't selling any stories. So Mama Day was super helpful.
Yes.
By Gloria Naylor.
Yes.
Because here was a respected black woman writer writing the metaphysical. And I was like, finally I saw myself in the kind of work I might dream of writing one day. But yeah, Stephen King was highly influential, and I would say for the most part, I mean, maybe, because I grew up in the Miami suburbs, I am not from a small town. I was in fact intimidated by Toni Morrison and the black women writers that I admired, because they were writing about a black rural southern experience I had not exactly had. In some ways, this was the book I've been running away from my whole life. You know, it's like that I would be expected to write that. But when my mother moved back to her hometown in Quincy, I started to see that small town life. And Stephen King also writes about that small town life. So maybe there's some of the influence there. But I think his biggest influence for me personally was the characters and showing me the importance of creating real people in your work. And if you do that, you can have anything happen and the readers will buy it. They'll believe it. They'll take your word for it. They will read 600 pages about a dog barking outside of a car, which is the plot of Cujo. If they care, and I sobbed when that book was over, but if they care about the characters.
Yes, yes. So you said earlier that black horror is in a bit of a renaissance. Can you explain that? Like, why now? Why now? Why is this the time?
You know, there are a lot of factors around why. I often pivot first to what was incredibly meaningful to me, both as a horror fan and a horror creative, was Get Out in 2017. And Camille used to work for Monkey Paw, you know, so she had a hand in creating some of those films that Jordan Peele did. That has been, I can't even express, at least on the cinematic side, how huge that was. as someone who's been pitching black horror in Hollywood since certainly since I got married in 1998, if you said black horror, you got blank looks on people's faces, or if not that, they would be like, oh, you mean like Beloved? Which, while it's a beautiful film, it did not make money. So that was the last comp, they call it. That last comparable you want is someone talking about Beloved when you're trying to pitch your story. So, and then when Get Out came out, there was a whole different vocabulary for black horror. People just seemed to get it. And for a while, there were too many people trying to imitate it and not understanding why it worked, trying to use lynching as horror, which is not entertaining. And horror, I think, first and foremost, is meant to be entertaining. It can teach, but it's supposed to be entertaining. So I think people who were excited, finally we could tell our story, got a little too excited about lynching and violence against black people as the monster. And that's not what Jordan Peele and Monkey Paw do. So that is huge. And then on the literary side, Victor LaValle's been out there for a while. The Changeling is on Apple TV Plus right now. So there's been a rise of just black horror writers. For a while, in the 90s, everybody was getting a book contract and mystery, romance, horror, nobody was looking for black horrors as far as anyone knew, but they would throw it up against the wall, see what would stick. And that's how a lot of us came to publish in the wake of Terry McMillan, frankly. That's how I got published, was Terry McMillan, not Stephen King. So that dissipated for a while. We lost people. We lost L.A. Banks, who was a pioneer with her Vampire Huntress series. We lost Octavia Butler. We lost a lot of our independent black bookstores. Yes. And we were all kind of adrift. And now in a weird, I don't know all of the factors, it's reconstituted on the other side, where oh, is that me? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why my alarm is set. Reconstituted on the literary side with, more than I can name. There are so many, in fact, Jordan Peele and Monkey Paw just published a black horror anthology called Out There Screaming that has 19 black authors, and I feel lucky I even got in. Such great writers, and it has a lot of your favorites in there that you don't think of as horror writers, like N.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor have stories in there. So that will show you right there just the richness. We have black horror podcasts right now, Nightlight podcast, which is short stories. So much happening on the literary side, so much happening on the cinematic side and television side all at once. The whys of it, I cannot tell you, except I have a couple of theories. One of them is that horror in general is having a great moment right now, as more people are realizing it's not just about blood on the wall. And like my mother, I think the reason she loved horror, and she was the first horror fan of my life, I think she figured out, even though we never talked about this, that horror can really help you relieve trauma by giving you a monster to focus it on. And maybe you can even kill it sometimes. But for me as an artist and as a fan of horror, it's not even about killing the monster. It's about, let's all of us stop having these individual experiences and have a meeting where we talk about what's happening in this house. We make a plan and we fight. So my class at UCLA is called The Sunken Place, Racism, Survival, and the Black Horror Aesthetic. Horror is survival stories. Either you are going to run and trip and fall, like they used to in the day, or you're going to be super prepared, like in Jordan Peele's Us. Like, I love that moment where Lupita's like, put on your shoes, because we got to get ready to run. Where's the bat? Survival. And even though, God willing, we don't have to run anymore, I think black people in particular have a genetic memory of running and hiding. And if you read the Reformatory, you'll see why. Or if you've read history, you know why. And some of it, a lot of it, is in our own families. So I think horror is having a moment in general because our times are so trying and so terrifying that it's kind of a relief to escape into a horror novel, which is what I was trying to do a little bit with the Reformatory. But black horror creators in particular, I think, have really latched onto this genre as a way to express sometimes racial trauma, but not always. And as you'll see if you read Out There Screaming, there are all kinds of ways to tell a Black horror story.
I think you're very, okay. Yeah, okay, so let's take some questions.
Oh, sure. Hey, you can ask one final question.
Oh, okay. All right, so back to the Reformatory. What do you want people to get out of this novel? Because I feel like, and people who've read it, how many people in here have actually read it in totality? Okay, all right, so you get, you have lots of different experiences while you're reading this book, correct? Yeah. And you get lots of different things out of this book. What do you want the reader to get out of reading this book?
There are several things, so I'll try to keep it brief. First, say their names. Not just Robert Stevens, who died at the Dozier School, but Harry T. Moore, you know, my parents, my family, that whole generation of people, just to acknowledge that they were here. We are losing them. They were here and they made an impact. That really was probably number one. Beyond that, I loved it when one reviewer called it a call to action. Because even though it's set in 1950, there were so many aspects of the criminal justice system that I intentionally created to mirror what we're experiencing today. Starting with those blue lights in your rearview mirror, that still makes our heart race, whether we did anything or not.
That's right.
When someone knocks on your door to take your child to juvenile hall over a schoolyard kick, which is still happening every day. Your helplessness when your child is, or a loved one is taken away from you. The fact that the whole system has a hand in this process. All of that. But the thing that I'm most excited about, and I needed this for me as the writer too, just to get through it, was that despite what you've said, and it's true, it is difficult at times to read, I really wanted it to be hopeful. That's why I made Robert 12 instead of 15, not just to make him more empathetic, but because he's closer to his childlike spirit of play and resilience. And, oh, okay, there's ghosts here, now what? I would have been cowered under my bed the whole time. You know, as an adult. But children, at times, I mean, they need therapy later, but in the moment, can pivot. They can pivot. And I wanted his superpower is that, his childlike spirit and his optimism. Despite everything, I wanted him to have kind of a sense of optimism that could hopefully transfer to the reader. And I feel very gratified when I see reviews that talk about, no matter how hellish some aspects of the story are, that it's also imbued with hope. Because I can't write books that don't have hope.
Yes. And I was going to say that. I mean, the way that the book, like, there is joy in this book. Yeah. So I don't want anybody, it's a hard read for sure, but there is joy in this book.
No, trust me when I say.
And you have to read it all the way to the end.
Yeah, you got to read to the end. So despite what I say, I dedicate it to Robert Stevens, and I tell a little bit of his story at the beginning. But believe you me when I tell you, I was not going to spend 7 years writing a book that had that ending. I wanted to give him a different ending. That was really the whole point.
Yes.
A different ending.
Yes. Excellent. Let's take some questions.
In order to be prompt, you know, because I know we have a lot of questions. I want to give you a big round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So now we don't have a mobile mic, but if you project, then we can hear you. So I will open it up for questions. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Let's go. Y'all want to stay here all night? Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. I've been waiting for this all month. I have a question about your writing process. Your prose was beautiful, and it was laced with so much exposition. A lot of it felt very necessary, like about their father, their mother, and then a lot of it was these beautiful stories that add depth to the characters. And I come from the screenwriting side of things, so novel writing is like blows my mind. It's this beautiful mystery. I'm wondering how you outline this, when you knew to put certain parts of the exposition, and then when you knew it's okay to add this bit of character depth, you know, where that ended up stopping, you know, how that process worked.
Thank you for that question. And it is very different. I'm the opposite. I'm learning screenwriting now and having to leach all that out and try to express it visually, which is a whole different thing. And the short answer is I didn't always know. I mean, part of the uncertainty of writing this book and reading the same pages over and over and over and over again is you can't even tell, is it any good, right? As the author, it's like, ugh, is Gloria thinking about her mom and her mom talking about the soil is red because of all the blood. Do they really want to hear that? Does that work? You don't know. But as a screenwriter, I have learned outlining. And where I got in trouble with the Reformatory was when I ran out of outline. Like when I didn't know what was supposed to happen next, and I wouldn't force myself to sit and engage with what was happening next. So my husband and I have a process we call life writing. We have a whole podcast called Life Writing, by the way, where the central tenet is 1 sentence a day. And believe you me when I tell you, there were many days when that was all I could do. If that, because this was so hard. And one of the breakthroughs I had was when I used my sentence a day to finish outlining the damn story. Instead of just free writing, and I'm not much of a free writer, I knew the ending. I was writing up to the ending. I had cast the ending. Ms. Lottie was supposed to be Cicely Tyson, right?
I totally see it. Yes.
That was it. I was trying to write up to my ending, but there were some periods I knew up until Robert's very first trial at the Funhouse, which if you've read it, you know what that is. But beyond that point, I wasn't quite sure. And then just a sentence a day, like this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. And then, luckily I'm a million years old, so I have a lot of experience with filling in the blanks. But there's no easy way to teach that. Like how much isn't too much? That's what your beta readers will tell you. I was losing interest during this part, or this seemed like maybe it should happen later. Sometimes I overwrite the exposition, like in a short story. I tell my students to start with what's called like an oh crap moment. Like we begin our story already in progress. Like let's not spend the first 5 pages on something that happened to them when they were children, 5 years or whatever. Let's start in progress. And then I end up taking all that out, all that exposition out, and either it's just for my own information or I find a way to seed it in. It's like the difference between dumping the whole salt shaker in the chapter or just sprinkling the seasoning throughout the book. And it takes practice. That's the best thing. Just keep writing.
Thank you.
Sure. Give me out.
It's incredible to see you.
Incredible to see you.
Yes. I love your work, clearly. I love the way that, as a Black speculative artist, of course, you're able to interweave historical accuracy with Black futures, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the call to action? Where are we going to move toward? Mm-hmm. While also honoring the ancestors and folks whose stories get lost and eaten by the archive in different ways. So I'm curious, as someone who I approach horror from a very spiritual perspective, and I think sometimes we misconstrue the spirit in a lot of like white canon horror. Mm-hmm. Your work doesn't do that, and I love that your work does not do that. So I'm curious, what is your spiritual practice like as you are kind of conjuring the stories of these characters, kind of filling the holes in the archive, like Saida Hartman style, right? To add a wholeness, right? So I'm wondering, like, are you in communication with like yourself, your ancestry? Like, how do you honor these spirits? How do you know when you're like, maybe I shouldn't speculate this. Maybe this is a little bit too sensitive?
I love that question. I wish I were more of that question. In many ways, I used to go to a church in Los Angeles called First AME Church. And one of the, you can see it on YouTube. There's Reggie Hudlin has a movie called Space Traders, and the church scenes take place at First AME Church. And there's this mural on the wall of moments from Black history. And there were many, many times I was sitting in that church feeling like my religion is that history. Mm-hmm. I really think, the first thing I thought of when you said spiritual practice was history. To try to commune with it, to try to honor it. It's not so much, I wish I heard voices. I wish I guess I had more of the experiences that I write about. But the closest I've had are dreams, and you could interpret it as just a dream. You know, after my grandmother passed away, I dreamed she was standing by her closet door, and she said, "It's in here," and disappeared. And I told my mother about it. She said, "Well, I did find, you know, $150 in her coat pocket in that closet." And I was like, "Well, Mom, I don't think Grandma's gonna come from across the plain to tell us about." She's like, "Oh yes, she would." But it's little stuff like that. I mean, I've had a couple of consultations with psychics, you know, just one while I was writing Joplin's Ghost, and he claimed that Joplin had a suggestion, and like a true writer, I was like, you leave composing music to you. So I don't really know. I mean, I meditate, but I have a picture of the book I wrote with my mom on the back of my door. I can see it in every Zoom I'm in. It's like always with me. And I really feel like that is my guide, because the key to the future is through that history, if only we can remember all those lessons. And maybe one day I'll be able to answer that on a better level.
Oh, yeah, here. Yeah, you can.
So you said in a previous interview that Black history is Black horror, and you've also said in another interview that that real human evil is more horrifying than anything you could write. Considering that this book is so intimately tied with Black history and just American history and your own personal history, I'm interested in how do you take care of yourself during that time period when you're writing this book? How do you give the story what is required and put responsibility on it, while also taking care of yourself mentally and emotionally?
I appreciate that question. My biggest technique of self-care was avoidance. So when I say it took me 7 years to write this book, it wasn't because I was writing this book for 7 years. It's because, I mean, any other excuse I had, like an editor wants a short story. I wrote a whole short story collection while I was writing this book. I wrote my first produced television while I was writing this book. Oh, wow. So the Twilight Zone, as a matter of fact, with Steve, we did with Monkey Paw. So that was the first thing. But the other thing was, seriously, the fantasy element. And this is the thing that I think inexperienced horror creatives don't understand about the difference between the horrific and horror, right? So there are some things that I'm sure some of you reading this will find horrific, but bear in mind all the things I did not put in this book that I absorbed and had to chew on and had to still remember, things that I don't even want to mention in interviews. Like, I wouldn't even want to like send you home with these images and thoughts in your mind. So I had to leach all that out, and the way I made it fun, if that's the right word, because writing is fun to me, to disappear in a story and 2 hours later, it's like, where'd the time go? That's my happy place. And this book was making me sad in my happy place. I had a son Robert's age for a time when I was working on it. So it really is the fantasy element, the fun of creating the ghosts. Even though the ghosts are scary, there's more to the ghosts than being scary. Mm-hmm. So I get to do some world building and ask myself, what would some of the differences be between the living and the dead? Is it possible for a living child to have a friendship with a Haint? What would that look like? That was the fun for me. And the other part was in the warden, even though reviewers keep comparing him to some of the worst characters in literature in terms of how awful he is as a person. But it was fun for me to create him, to give him the nuance that because he is such a psychopath, which means he is not constrained by societal expectations, right? He also has his own opinions about race, his own opinions about the lie against Robert. Like, so he's like, Robert will call him the master of lies, but he's also sometimes telling the truth in a way that other people won't in this town. And that was fun for me, to create that nuance in him, even though he's a terrible, terrible person. Every once in a while he'd be like, well, we know your daddy didn't do that. Like, what? So that was fun.
Yeah, I thought it was an incredible book.
Thank you.
And using words like fun and the young lady over here talking about beautiful is difficult with a book so heavy like this. my hope is that this book can reach a wider audience than just the Black community, and people can read and understand that this is set just 70 years ago, and the amount of systemic racism that is built into all of these things that are happening could not possibly have gone away today.
Right.
We haven't worked through that.
I wanted to show the seeds for people who don't understand the seeds, like what Black Lives Matter, or like why do people are down on the police. They're like, well, let's look at the history.
Right.
And I really, really hope, I'm glad to hear about this group suing, because I'm hoping that even though this is a work of fiction, I know that some of the Dozier School family members also want to sue for reparations. I really hope it'll help get the message out.
So we have time for one more question. And I see a hand up, so it's you, sir.
There are a number of scenes in the book that felt to me like they were pointed at a non-Black audience. Miss Lottie pulled over on the side of the road, people standing around as a family inside the house, waiting for white people to attack, that sort of thing. To point out, these are things that are real, that Black people have gone through. Are there things that I, as a white guy, am not picking up on that you want to broadcast?
I'm gonna, well, okay, the whole book, yes. No, that's what she said. No. Well, let me just say, and thank you for that question. I don't think that those, I didn't think you were gonna pick those scenes as the ones aimed at white audiences. I thought you would talk more about sort of the scenes where I introduce white characters and their sort of limited allyship. So not everybody's evil white, but they're also ineffective, right? And that, is that aimed at allyship today? I mean, yeah, kinda, you know. But in terms of the pulled over by the police and sitting around the house waiting for those are stories from my family history, right? Or from my own experiences. Driving in Mississippi with my dad, pulled over for literally no reason, except he saw what he thought was two young Black men in the car. But then when he pulled us over, you should have seen the look on his face when it was a woman and an old Black man. That whole scenario he had in his head about what we were doing. Were y'all playing, what'd he say? Were you all playing peekaboo with that white pickup truck? He had a whole fantasy, and I literally used that language in the book, that this guy had created a fantasy about what they were doing. And in terms of huddling in the house, that was the Freedom House during my parents' voter registration campaigns in the 1960s, when people would fire into the house and you're afraid you're getting tapped by the FBI. So those weren't aimed at white audiences, but I'm glad for any audiences to understand that that is the level of terrorism it took to keep Jim Crow in place.
That was a perfect way to end.
Yeah.
And so we'll give her another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I always forget the mic. At any rate, okay. So this is how it's gonna go. We're gonna ask Ms. Due to go ahead and sit at the table. She's gonna sign some books. So we're gonna work it this way, if possible. And she'll sign your books, and then we'll just exit that way. Unless you wanna sit and talk to me, you know. We could do that. Thank you all so